Before the iPod, music was portable. But it was not truly personal. You could carry a cassette, a CD wallet, or a clunky early MP3 player, yet your music still felt limited by the machine in your hand. Portable listening already existed, of course. Sony's Walkman had changed daily life decades earlier by letting people step outside with music sealed inside headphones. But that freedom still came one album, one tape, one disc at a time. Then the internet broke the old model. MP3 files spread fast, Napster exploded, and suddenly millions of listeners had access to music in a form that the old hardware world was never built to handle. The industry looked panicked, and honestly, it was. That is the world the iPod entered in October 2001. Apple did not invent portable music, and it did not invent digital music either. What Apple built was a cleaner answer to a mess that was getting bigger every month. And that distinction matters. Because the rise of the iPod was never just about a gadget. It was about a new relationship between a person, a library, and a private world nobody else could hear. When Apple unveiled the first iPod, the headline pitch was simple: 1,000 songs in your pocket. In 2001, that sounded almost unreal. Not because digital music was new, but because carrying that much music in something this small felt like a leap. The first model had a 5 GB hard drive, a mechanical scroll wheel, FireWire syncing, and a price that made some people laugh. $400 for a music player? In the beginning, critics saw elegance. They also saw risk. And the criticism was not baseless. It only worked with a Mac at launch. It entered a market where other digital players already existed. Some had more storage. Some were cheaper. So why did this one feel different almost immediately? Because Apple understood that specs alone were not the point. Most early MP3 players felt like computer accessories. The iPod felt like an object you wanted to keep with you, touch, show, and use without thinking. That is where the story really begins. Not with capacity. Not with battery life. With design turning technology into habit. And once a device becomes a habit, culture starts to move around it. To understand why the iPod mattered, you have to remember how awkward music management used to be. Your songs were on CDs, on burned discs, in random folders, ripped at different bit rates, named badly, and scattered across a computer like digital debris. Apple's genius was not only the player. It was the system around it. iTunes and iPod together turned digital music from a technical chore into a smooth consumer experience. Plug it in, sync it, go. That sounds ordinary now, almost boring. But it was not boring then. Automatic syncing felt magical because it removed friction at exactly the moment when digital music was becoming abundant and messy at the same time. This was the shift. The iPod was not asking people to become more technical. It was asking technology to become more human. And that single reversal would define not just the iPod, but much of consumer tech that followed. Music stopped behaving like files and started behaving like memory again. Not because the format changed, but because the interface got out of the way. That is a much bigger revolution than people often admit. But the iPod alone was not enough to transform the industry. A portable player solves only half the problem. The bigger question was this: where would people get their music legally, easily, and in a format that matched this new machine? In 2003, Apple launched the iTunes Music Store. The pitch was almost suspiciously simple. Buy individual songs for 99 cents, download them fast, and stop dealing with the chaos of piracy, fake files, and bloated album purchases you did not want. That mattered because the music industry had spent years treating digital distribution like a threat to be crushed. Apple treated it like a customer problem to be solved. That difference sounds subtle. It changed almost everything. Listeners no longer had to buy a full CD for one track they loved. They could build a collection song by song, mood by mood, moment by moment. That is where music became more than portable. It became modular and deeply personal. And once people started building personal libraries track by track, a quiet psychological shift happened. The collection no longer belonged to the shelf in your room. It belonged to you, directly, as a reflection of taste, identity, and memory. Then came the move that blew the door open. In late 2003, Apple brought iTunes to Windows. That ended the idea that the iPod was only a beautiful toy for Mac users. Suddenly it was aimed at almost everyone. This was the real expansion point. Because Apple's design was strong, yes. But scale came from compatibility. Once Windows users could join the system, the iPod stopped feeling niche and started looking inevitable. At the same time, Apple kept refining the hardware. New generations got thinner, cleaner, more polished. The click wheel became iconic. White earbuds became instantly recognizable from across a street, a bus, or a classroom. This is where branding and daily life fused. You were no longer just using a music player. You were signaling a taste, a lifestyle, even a kind of optimism about the future. Few consumer devices have ever carried that aura so well. And notice what happened here. The technology disappeared into the ritual. Wake up. Pick a playlist. Leave the house. Soundtrack the day. That routine would become so normal that it is almost hard to remember a world before it. The iPod did not stay one thing for long. Apple understood that scale also means segmentation. Some people wanted capacity. Some wanted small size. Some wanted color. Some wanted affordability. So the iPod family started to branch. The iPod mini helped transform the device into fashion as much as function. Smaller body, colored aluminum, easier one-handed use. It felt less like a piece of computer hardware and more like something that fit naturally into everyday style. Then the Nano made the shift even sharper. Suddenly your music library looked impossibly small, almost weightless. The old burden of carrying music was fading fast. The experience was becoming frictionless. And the shuffle took the idea in another direction entirely. No screen. No library browsing in the traditional sense. Just movement, surprise, and a trust that your selection of songs would carry the mood for you. Strange idea, right? It worked. This product family mattered because it expanded the meaning of personal music. It was no longer just about owning songs. It was about choosing how music fit your body, your pocket, your commute, your run, your room, your life. By 2007, Apple announced that it had sold 100 million iPods. That number says something obvious: the product was a commercial giant. But it also says something deeper. Millions of people had adopted a new private audio habit at massive scale. And that habit changed public space. Airports, sidewalks, trains, dorm rooms, offices, gyms. People were physically present, but acoustically elsewhere. Their chosen soundtracks began to shape how they moved through ordinary life. This is why the iPod matters culturally, not just commercially. It normalized the idea that daily life could have a customizable internal score. Not radio chosen by someone else. Not whatever happened to be playing in a room. Your score. That had consequences. Music listening became more solitary, more precise, more mood-driven. Playlists began replacing albums as the dominant emotional unit for many listeners. The sequence became yours to design. And once technology lets you curate emotion with that much control, it starts touching more than entertainment. It changes memory formation. It changes travel. It changes heartbreak. It changes the way a city feels when a certain song starts at the right second. The iPod also changed the business of music in a way that still echoes. For years, labels had been built around selling albums as physical products. Apple helped normalize the single-track digital purchase as a mainstream habit. That brought convenience, but it also rearranged value. Listeners could unbundle the album. They could take one song and leave the rest. For consumers, that felt liberating. For parts of the industry, it was a structural shock. At the same time, Apple made legal digital buying feel easier than many illegal alternatives. That was a huge strategic insight. When the paid option becomes simpler than the pirated one, behavior begins to shift. Of course, this did not solve every problem in music. Artists still fought over compensation, labels still fought over control, and the digital transition remained messy. But Apple proved that convenience was not a side issue. It was the battlefield. And maybe that is the key insight of the entire iPod era. The winning format is rarely just the one with the best quality. It is often the one that fits real human behavior with the least resistance. Then, almost quietly, the next change arrived. The smartphone started absorbing the jobs of separate devices. Camera, phone, internet tool, and music player began collapsing into one object. And that created a problem for the iPod, even as Apple led the shift. The irony is almost perfect. Apple built the machine that made personal music feel essential, and then Apple built the machine that made carrying a separate music device feel optional. That is not failure. That is technological succession. Streaming pushed the transition even further. Once millions of songs lived in the cloud, the emotional center of music shifted again. Ownership started giving way to access. The personal library became less physical, less fixed, more fluid. That change solved one problem and created another. You no longer had to curate every file manually. But something intimate was lost too. The iPod era was about carrying your music. The streaming era is often about renting infinity. And that is why people still speak about the iPod with unusual warmth. It sat in a strange sweet spot between scarcity and overload. Big enough to feel expansive. Small enough to feel chosen. When Apple discontinued the iPod in 2022, the announcement felt less like a shock and more like the closing of a chapter that had already become memory. The function had survived everywhere. The dedicated object had not. But endings can hide scale. The iPod's legacy is not limited to the hardware line itself. Its real legacy lives inside modern expectations, seamless syncing, clean interfaces, personal libraries, pocket media, and the idea that technology should adapt to feeling. Even the way we talk about listening changed. Playlist culture, soundtrack thinking, mood curation, private audio bubbles in public space, all of that expanded in the world the iPod helped normalize. The device is gone. The behavior remains. And maybe that is the truest measure of influence. The most powerful technologies do not just sell well. They quietly rewrite what feels ordinary. After the iPod, carrying your own world of sound stopped feeling futuristic. It became normal. That is a rare achievement. And it explains why the iPod still feels bigger than its screen, its battery, or its hard drive. It changed the scale of music by changing the scale of ownership, access, and intimacy all at once. So what was the iPod really? A successful product? Yes. A design icon? Absolutely. But more than that, it was the machine that helped turn music into a portable interior space, one you could enter whenever the outside world became too loud. It arrived after the Walkman had already taught people to move with music, and after the internet had already shattered the old industry model. But the iPod fused convenience, identity, and desire more cleanly than almost anything before it. That is why this story still matters. Not because one company sold millions of devices, but because millions of people reorganized private life around them. A commute sounded different. A breakup sounded different. Even boredom sounded different. And maybe the strangest part is this: the iPod made music feel more personal at the exact moment technology was becoming more networked and more global. In a louder world, it gave people a sharper sense of inner ownership. That is not a small legacy. So, did the iPod give us more control over our music, or did it quietly change the way we experience life itself? Subscribe for more stories about the devices that changed human behavior in ways people barely noticed at the time.